So this is Dan of Vagabond Awake, and today we have Michael on the channel with Offshore Citizen. Michael on his channel, YouTube channel, talks about taxes, wealth protection, second passports, offshore banking, and citizenships, and much, much more. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for taking the time to come on the channel.
Thanks for having me. Very good to see you guys today.
This information is, watching what's happening in the markets right now, this information gets more important every day. Michael, what's your home country and where are you living these days?
So I'm originally from Canada, and so I've had various stints there before permanently living there in 2017. And so I've lived in a bunch of places, but my main place of residence now is UAE in Dubai.
Now, Michael, the topics you cover are fascinating. I watch you from time to time, and presently you're studying taxes, wealth, second passports, and banking, all these sorts of things, second citizenships. So, what was your background before you started traveling the world and helping expats figure this stuff out?
I mean, I think at the core, I always had an entrepreneurial streak, and so it's kind of entrepreneurialism that drove me into these things. So I started my first business when I was in high school. Had nothing to do with this, but it was computer business. And so the thing that kind of like mainly led down the path of international tax, international corporate structuring, whatever you want to call that, was I was trying to do some business between Canada and the U.S. And it was super frustrating because I would call up lawyers in the U.S. and I would say, "Hey, what should I do?" And they would say, "Oh, do this." I would say, "Great, I'm in Canada." And they're like, "Oh, then I can't advise you." And I would call lawyers in Canada and I would say, "Hey, what should I do?" And they would say, "Do this." And I'd say, "Well, we're investing in the US." And they'd say, "Oh, I can't advise you." So kind of through that process and through a mixture of things that were going on, I had another friend who was in sort of a similar situation. So I'd had to kind of navigate this and learn about banking and all sorts of things that didn't seem to make a heck of a lot of sense in how they were organized. But he was also in sort of a similar situation to me, also some part of the world. And he was paying taxes and saw these front page of the Wall Street Journal saying, GE gets an $800 million tax credit and, all this. And he's like, what is going on here? Like, why am I paying all this tax when they're not? And so we started to write to accountants and lawyers and say, hey, what are these guys doing? And people would say, oh, it's illegal. And he said, come on, it's a Fortune 500 company on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's not illegal. So eventually he found some really great international tax attorneys. And then he contacted me and said, hey, listen, what can I do to get you to come and do this with me? And so then I mentored under some really great attorneys for a period of few years and kind of worked with them. And that was kind of the beginning of the story of international tax planning and other sort of things related to it.
So for Americans, Canadians, Brits, Aussies, what country and or countries banks would you suggest they open accounts in where they could store money in foreign currency to diversify their retirement nest egg? Seeing that many of these home country currencies are being devalued these days. What are your thoughts about where they could open accounts overseas?
Well, I'll maybe push back on a few of those things for a slight second. So first of all, it depends where you live, not just where you're from, right? So Americans, the U.S. passport follows you everywhere. But if you're a Canadian, most banks don't really care that you're Canadian. They care more about where you live. And so a lot of banks will say, okay, if you're living in Canada, we're going to have more issues with it. But if you move to Thailand or the Philippines or something like that, well, then we have no issues. So it depends a lot on where they go to live. But I would say that there's a few places, and it depends also how much money you have to put into a bank. So, for example, I would say the premier banking spot, to the extent that you can open accounts there, is Singapore. Now, if you're living in some place like the US, they're not going to open an account for you at a bank in Singapore. And even if you are living in some place like UAE, for example, they're probably going to require a minimum deposit of somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000. So if you can afford that, then that's great. If you can't, which a bunch of people cannot, well, then you need to look at other options. Similar to thing with that would be Switzerland. So Switzerland, usually you're looking at $1 million minimums. They're probably a little bit more flexible in terms of where they'll take people from. But that being said, a lot of people don't want to put $1 million. Honestly, even if you can afford the $1 million, the fees may not be worth it. So you might just say, you know what, screw these guys. And so this is where I was going to push back a little bit. If you're not from in, say, the US, you should probably have a US bank account. Like US banking is, you might say, oh, currencies are devaluing. Yeah, but they're probably devaluing more relative to the US dollar than they are just, on their own. So the US dollar is actually stronger than, say you're in Turkey, right? That's kind of the classic example. The lira has just been absolutely abysmal. You'd be better off storing your money in US dollars in the US than storing your money in Turkish lira in Turkey. So I would say that would be one place that people could consider. Another place is the Channel Islands. You can go to banks like Santander and Standard Chartered. Again, not like zero. So in the US, you can get commercial bank or like retail banking, and so you can have like no minimum balances. It's very, very accessible. But if you were going to go to one of these other places, you're getting premier banking, so it's going to be a little bit higher requirements. And then it depends a little bit again on where you're willing to go live. If you're willing to go get a residency in some countries, usually you can get banking there. So for example, if you get a residency in UAE, you can pretty easily get banking in UAE. If you were to be in Europe, then you can pretty easily get banking in Europe. Although to be fair, even without getting residency, you could get someplace like Portugal pretty easily for banking. I don't know that banking is amazing in Portugal, but it's not the worst in the world either. Georgia would be another example of a place that you can fairly accessibly get banking, although they become a bit harder to deal with over the years. So I think we started banking in Georgia in like 2015 or something, and it was pretty great back then. And then somewhere shortly before COVID, they got a little more tricky. So those would be kind of some quick examples, but it depends a lot on your individual circumstances. I always say there's no one size fits all. Anyone who gives you what is it they say, prescription with diagnosis is malpractice. So want to always look at your situation.
So Americans are required when they're opening foreign accounts, they're required to report
Yep.
that to the U.S.
Yep.
government. Does Canada or Britain or Australia have similar reporting requirements presently?
Yeah, it varies by the country, obviously, and usually there's a minimum threshold. So, like, if you're over $100,000, would be a common one. So, if you have over $100,000 in assets, so as a Canadian, say you would have to report. Now, we're talking there about bank deposits or similar stuff. Real estate, for example, wouldn't be reportable. Gold typically isn't reportable. Stuff like that. But yeah, if you're talking about having bank accounts, then typically if you're over a certain threshold, then it's very common that you have to report. And even if you don't, your bank probably is. So, that they have some ways of figuring that stuff out.
In that example of 100,000, is that the net worth of the individual or the amount of money they're putting in that bank?
Amount of money. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Foreign assets. Yeah. If your foreign assets exceed that.
Yeah. Okay. And I think in the U.S. it has a pretty low reporting requirement.
Yeah, like 10 grand.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Good. So for people that want to retire offshore but do not want to transfer all of their assets from their home country to their new country of residence, what third countries would you suggest thinking about setting up an offshore entity such as a corporation or trust that would provide them with preferential tax treatment possibly, or reasonable startup costs, reduced annual reporting requirements, and maybe a little to no residency? What are your thoughts on that subject?
If you'd like my free ebook about how I fired my boss and traveled the world for 17 years and how I pay for things, come to Vagabond Buddha and grab the free ebook.
Well, so companies are a bit tricky because a lot of countries in the world will tax a foreign company if it's quote unquote managed and controlled from wherever you're resident. And so it, again, depends on the country. Like if you're in Thailand, for example, they have no management control rules, so you don't have to worry about that. And so if you're in Thailand, maybe you can set up a company in Hong Kong, or depending on what types of assets you're holding, maybe in Singapore, maybe in the U.S., maybe there's some particular UK structures. There's a variety of things you might do. But if you were to say move to Spain, well, Spain has these management control rules, and so there's more to it than just forming a company. You need to actually have foreign directors, and that's going to add costs and hassles and stuff like this. And so that would be true of most what I would call former developed West. So a lot of the EU countries, Canada, the US, Australia, UK, New Zealand, Japan, et cetera, they would all have these types of rules. So that's like your first thing. Is just you really need to be aware of what are the rules in the place that you're resident, and understand that the rules where you're resident could affect the companies that you own abroad. And then the other thing is, I always tell people, like, you want to go for the simplest possible solution. So there's no reason to overly complicate your situation. Some people, I think, almost like the idea of having like, hey, I could have some offshore companies or something. But I would start by asking, for your situation, do you need an offshore company? Like, let's say that you moved to Cyprus and you're retired and you've got some investments. Well, they don't tax capital gains anyway. So, that's fine. If you're into the non-dom, foreign dividends aren't taxed. So, that's fine. And so you might be in a situation where you don't actually need to use such a structure at all if you move to the right places. Now, if you're going to say be in Canada or be in UK or some places like this, then you could possibly set up a structure and you could actually possibly save a lot of tax, but it's not really about where you form the company. It's about all this other stuff of like what they would call substance, which is, okay, you better have foreign employees, you better have foreign management and control, and then you have to navigate something called CFC rules. But it's doable. In theory, it's possible. It will just come at a cost. And so then you need a proportional ROI, right? Like if you're spending $30,000 a year to save $30,000 a year, this was a bad deal. And if you were spending $30,000 a year to save $300,000 a year, it was probably a good deal. So
It depends.
it depends. It depends. Unfortunately, yeah. I wish I could give you like the magic snap the fingers, but this is just not the reality. I think that like it's very dangerous to think in those sense. I think if I was a person, I would say, okay, like where am I willing or interested to go? Like you're in Philippines, I think you said right now. Philippines
Yeah.
is very tax friendly for foreigners. So okay, if you're willing to go there, there's just like you can probably get a very simple solution that does very good stuff for you. If you're in Thailand, Malaysia, a little bit less, but potentially if you're in UAE or like parts of the Middle East, for sure. And then some places are just low tax, right? If you are in some places in Eastern Europe, they're low tax. I lived in Bulgaria for a while. That's like 10% flat tax or 5% on dividends. So you probably end up at somewhere between 5 and 7.5%. If you're in some of these Latin American places like Costa Rica or Panama or Paraguay or Uruguay or something like that, like you can get very low taxes just natively because it's a good place. It's where you have a problem is like when you're going to be in a country that their tax rules are stricter, then you need to be a bit more sophisticated, and that's more than a 10-minute conversation probably to answer the specifics for any given person in that case.
U.S. citizens, have been taxed based on the worldwide income, and over the last few decades, some Americans have decided to renounce citizenship. But before renouncing, obviously, you don't want to be a man without a country. You need to get a second passport of some kind. So what's the easiest country to get citizenship without a big investment, and how long does it take?
Okay, yeah, so that big investment part is a good qualifier there. So for people who don't know, there's sort of 3 loose ways you can get a passport. One is you can make some sort of an investment or donation. The second is you can go and you can actually go and live somewhere and naturalize. And the third is you can get through some sort of form of descent. Technically, there's a few other exceptions, like if you marry certain people and stuff like that, but usually those are the categories. So first of all, I would say if you have ancestry from a particular part of the world, I would highly recommend you check into it because that might give you a really cheap, easy path to a great passport. So like absolutely you should do that if that's an option for you. Usually it has to be like your grandparents or more recently who were living in that country, but it's worth checking out. If you're going to go live in a country, the fastest, easiest places to get citizenship for most people is Argentina and Peru. Argentina in particular doesn't have a language test, and so that's really attractive. Dominican Republic technically as well, but Dominican Republic is not a very good passport, so most people probably don't want to go and be there. And then you get kind of some dispersion leading out from those places. And usually, like a lot of places, you can get a citizenship in about 5 years of residency, or at least you can apply for a citizenship. So, for example, Portugal is like a wonderful place if you want to get set up there. 5 years of residency. Okay, you have to pass a very basic Portuguese test. Their bureaucracy is really slow, so it's probably going to be 7 years before you actually get it. But it's a great passport. They allow dual citizenship. These things are all good. For some people from certain parts of the world, like for example, if you're from Latin American countries or if you're from Philippines, actually, then someplace like Spain can be really attractive because they have special programs built around that. If you're somebody who has Jewish origins, then you could certainly go and get an Israeli passport. They've made that a little bit more difficult recently, but that's actually a pretty good option for the right people. And then if you're kind of going beyond that, we could talk about like people who are actually going to, spend money, which is more common. And so there's a handful of countries that you can pay a donation. Typically, you're looking at 150 to 250,000 for most of these. There's 5 Caribbean countries. There's Nauru in the South Pacific. There's Vanuatu. There's a few others, and then you could also just invest money. So you could buy a property in Turkey, or you could make an investment in Egypt, and those are not quite as good passports, but there you're not donating the money. Like you own a property, 5 years later you could sell the property, and so it's not perceived as being so crazy. And then there's places like Malta is like if you're going to go top tier, but that's over $1 million. Takes about 14 months, and there's a few other like kind of unofficial programs that sometimes are available if you can make the right donations or invest in the country or contribute something accordingly.
You mentioned Argentina. What's the time period for them? So that was top on
It's a
your
2-year
list.
process.
Wow,
2 year.
that's
Yeah.
sweet.
Yeah. So and so you live there for 6 months a year for 2 years. That's not an insane commit for a lot of people. Mexico is one I think like shouldn't be overlooked as well, because even though it's a 5-year process, your first 3 years you don't have to spend any physical time in the country, so you can just get the residency, which is a nice residency to have anyway, because like if you have permanent residency, it doesn't expire, so that's great. And then you can go back in the last 2 years. You have to spend 18 months in the last 2 years, and the Mexican passport's like actually a pretty strong passport. So I don't know. I think people are smart to get at least the residency in Mexico, so you've just kind of got that backup. A lot of people were kind of concerned during COVID that places were locked down and Mexico was pretty open, so that was cool. A lot of people really like living in Mexico. It's it's a pretty big country. It has a lot of diversity, nice climate, stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's like not a bad idea for people to do, even if they never take advantage of the passport side of it.
This is a great body of knowledge you have. Appreciate your coming on the channel. So what are some of the countries that people move to that you think are maybe overrated when you consider tax treatment and residency requirements?
Something to be aware of is a lot of people move to places and don't follow the laws, and they can get away with it in those places. Like a good example of this is Bali or like Indonesia, right? So Indonesian taxes are actually not very good, and it's actually quite hard to work around them legally. There are some ways you can utilize particular structures, but generally speaking, their rules are quite strict. However, Indonesia doesn't enforce their rules very well, and so people can, more or less do whatever and still get away with it. So, how do you feel about that? Some people are perfectly fine with it. Other people, maybe not so much. One of the things that I pay a bunch of attention to is where people stay. So there are some places that on the surface look great. And, I deal with clients all over the world, hundreds, thousands of clients. And so I just get to see where people go, right? And for example, Panama and Malta are 2 countries that are on paper like really great, very tax efficient in a lot of ways, although Malta just got worse, but very tax efficient in general. You think the climate is pretty good, you think it's fairly accessible to a bunch of places, residency is pretty easy, it should be great. I can tell you like almost nobody stays in these places. They all leave. And so you're like, well, what's wrong with that? There's I kind of liken it to like this giant data aggregation and compression algorithm where you don't there's all these factors accounted for, and then it suddenly manifests in the form of people just don't stay there. So I don't generally advise people to move to those places, in part because I've seen everybody leave those places. So that would be something. A very particular set of people who like Paraguay. Paraguay is mostly not considered to be a very good place to live at all. Most people don't like it, but there are a few people who do. And like I've had clients, I remember this one guy, and he was like, Michael, I know all the objections. Those are the reasons I'm going there. I'm like, okay, perfect. Like if you know what you're getting into, and different thing for everybody. That's great. But you can have these places can be very tax efficient, and that's pretty good. But I think that you have to consider like the quality of life. Like I always tell people, like, why do we make money? Hopefully to make our lives and the lives of other people better. And if you're going to move to some place where you hate your life, that seems kind of counterproductive. So probably start by choosing places that you actually like, and then figure out how to optimize around that, as opposed to figuring out places that you're just going to save a bunch of money and you're going to hate your life because that's unsustainable and kind of a waste. So
what's the easiest residency in Europe, and does it allow holders of that residency to travel freely around without regard to the Schengen rules?
Yeah, so any Schengen country allows you free movement within the Schengen zone. And increasingly, like, Bulgaria and Romania and Cyprus were kind of the last three holdouts. Okay, Cyprus isn't a full Schengen member yet, but, transitioning there. Bulgaria, Romania just kind of came online. In general, if you're anywhere in the EU, pretty much, I guess except Ireland, then you can have free travel if you have a residence permit there. The places that I would say are probably easiest depend a bit on how long you're going to be there. So in theory, the easiest thing to do is get a digital nomad visa. Digital nomad visas, probably you're looking at like Estonia, Malta, Croatia. There's a few others, but probably those are like some of the easiest. They're very fast processing time, et cetera. Now, the issue is those can't be renewed indefinitely. So it's great for getting it right away. If you're going to be there for a year, in some cases 2 years, et cetera, perfectly good. And you could bounce. You could say, okay, let me get Estonia this year, and let me get Croatia next year, and let me get Malta the year after that, and renew Malta. And like you could do that, but it's a bit of a hassle, right? So if you're not going to do that, then I would say Spain is like one of the easiest. You can like pretty easily get residency in Spain for a lot of people. That's very accessible. Portugal is pretty accessible but slow. Their system is very, very backed up. And so kind of the processing times are long. Now, typically, once you get the residence permit, you can be there, or there's basically two parts. You get like this visa, and then you have to go through an in-person application in the country. And so you can get from the foreign embassy your visa, you can come, and then while you're waiting for your permit, even though it might take a very long time, you can be there, so it's not a problem. But this being said, you will probably wait numerous months to get that appointment. So that's a little annoying compared to some other places. If you can invest 200 grand, then Cyprus is very easy to get residency in, and you can invest that into your own company, so it's not really like a real loss of capital or something. It's just you have to put money into a company. That's not so difficult. It's easier still if you can buy a property. Bulgaria is pretty easy to get residency in, provided you have a foreign company or something. So yeah, that's, I would say, quite accessible. And now that it's in the Schengen zone, it didn't used to have that benefit, right? Now you have kind of pretty broad accessibility, and it's super tax friendly, and the costs are low. I wouldn't say like the quality of life is the highest there, but as a base to travel from, it's pretty great. And yeah, so those would be a few options that are probably easier. Generally, if you go north, it's harder to get residency in Europe.
What are your thoughts on owning property in foreign countries, outside your home country? Who should do it? Who shouldn't? How long should someone who moves to a country wait to see if that country takes and they stay before they invest? What are your thoughts about the ownership?
So again, depends on the country, because in some places, foreign ownership is more restricted and you have to have fancy structures or things like this. It just depends a little bit on the country. Also depends on what your purpose is, whether you're buying for lifestyle or whether you're buying for investment. So it's fairly rare that it is a great deal to invest from an investment standpoint in foreign countries. This was like kind of a surprise for me. I would have thought like, oh, you can go to these places and get these great deals, and you're going to have this upside. Now, this is mostly not true. And the reason it's mostly not true is because if you're in Canada, the US, Australia, UK, et cetera, you can apply leverage. And if you study where returns come from in real estate, it is mostly a financing game, not actually a property game. And the financial systems are just not very sophisticated in some of these places. So you probably won't get any leverage. And if you can't get leverage, then the after leverage returns are probably lower than or comparable to what you would get in the West anyway. And you have added risks of legal systems that are not going to protect you in the same way and stuff like this. So not to say that you shouldn't do it. There was a great run in Bali over the last while that it was a great deal to get property there. Thailand had a kind of good run. And a lot of these places post-COVID did very well. And so you can certainly have that. If you're looking at it from a lifestyle standpoint, I mean, if it was me, I would go and I would spend a solid year or two in the place to make sure I liked it, because it's a fairly long-term commitment. What you'll often find in some of these places, like I'll give Bulgaria as an example, getting renovations done, it's kind of a pain in the ass. Things are kind of slow. It's, I would love to own property in Italy. I think Italy is a wonderful country. Every time I talk to people about it, they're like, Michael, don't do it. Like, you will spend the next 10 years of your life just dealing with the bureaucracy of renovations, et cetera. There's some of those things that I think you have to be pretty committed to a place in order to justify buying there. And this does, some places do make it easier for sure. But if it was me, I would say at least go and spend like a year or two, integrate, know you like it, check out the areas, and then, I don't think it should be a rush to buy a property in most parts of the world, unless you're doing it for like, okay, I'm doing it just to get a residency, right? You buy a property in Turkey and you don't care that much about it. It's just, okay, I'm just getting the citizenship.
In addition to your channel, Offshore Citizen on YouTube, if people have specific questions on these topics, how can they contact you directly?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do is to go to offshorecitizen.net and send a message through there. So you can just submit a message. But also we do paid calls, or I do paid calls. So somebody can go to, there's a link in all of our videos, and so you can go and click on it and book a call, and feel free to ask any questions. So it's like you don't have to make a massive commitment of spending tens of thousands of dollars to go and do something. You can just get your questions answered fairly quickly.
That's great. Well, Michael, thanks for coming on the channel and sharing your story and what you're up to. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, it was really good to be here with you.
I've interviewed over 150 expats who've retired overseas all over the world. If you'd like to see some of those videos, click the playlist in the upper right-hand corner of your screen right now.